Welcome, everyone, to Too Much Music. We are back with you once again. I am Greg.
And I'm Allison.
And we used to be married. Now we just have this podcast. We've had a long history together, almost 20 years. So we know each other extremely well. We're best friends, super close. If you've been watching us, you know we're peas in a pod in a certain sense, right? And
it's not in an actual pod together. Like we have separate pods, but we're both
very
peas.
Separate.
We'll say we're two peas.
Uh-huh.
In different
two peas enjoying our own pods. How about that? Allison lives in town, and I do not. I live out in the country, out in the mountains, actually. So we have different lives in that kind of way. But we talk about music and our studios, music creation. And today, I think we're going to talk a little bit about our studios and the gear and the technology we use.
And maybe in particular, I personally would like to talk about some nerdy stuff. I'd like to talk about Linux. We need to talk about Linux, Greg.
We need to talk about Linux. I need to talk about Linux. I love Linux.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, historically, so like Greg said, we've known each other a long time. And I, as I'm an elder millennial. I will turn 44 this year, which makes me, the oldest living millennial, basically. And so I grew up, and when everybody was just starting to love Apple so much that they couldn't handle themselves.
It was for creatives.
Yeah, it was for creatives. And they were putting it. So when I was in my 20s, I got a MacBook Pro, and that's what I used for a computer, and that's what I used to record for years. And so when I met Greg, that's what I was using. And I didn't really think very hard about it, to be honest. I had used Windows before that, Windows Vista or 95 or whatever. I don't know, like all those old versions of Windows. And yeah, the Apple stuff seemed so cool to me at the time. And then I just went with that. But we started working together on a startup. And then, so through that, I started getting more involved in technical things, I would say. Starting, learning at least about code and how that worked, what that generally was, which was not something I really had any experience with before that. And then when we quit the startup and moved away from New York, I didn't know what to do. I had been in a PhD program for music. I was on a music academic track, and I didn't know what to do. And I said to Greg, I don't know what to do. What should I do? Like with my life right now, which is not really a fair question to ask, but I think that's what I did. And Greg said, why don't you learn Linux? And I was like, what the fuck is Linux? No, at that point I did know from the startup what it was, but so I think I installed Debian is what I would have done, because that's what Greg would have said to do.
I think I installed Debian.
Yeah, maybe you installed Debian.
Let me just jump in and say sort of where I came from there, right? Because that's where we intersect. So I'm not a millennial. I am a Gen X, solid Gen Xer, and got to watch the Apple fuckery from an older age. Did not get swept up into it, but when I was going off to graduate school at Eastman, I was awarded the an assistantship in the Computer Music Center, which was running Next Cubes. So they're fully Linux machines, or not Linux, but Unix machines, the Next operating system. And then we had Silicon Graphics machines, which are running another version of Unix called Solaris. So, yeah, it's like,
I still don't know what those really are.
Well, they're versions of Unix, and then Linux was new. The Linux kernel, this is the early 90s now. And so that's when the Linux kernel came about, and people were just starting to use it for audio or for computation, not really for recording things, but for computing C-sound and many other things. So anyway, as I was going to have that assistantship, I wanted to get out of the MIDI studio and jump straight to the cool stuff. So I took a job at a place called LexisNexis, which still exists, and they ran these Solaris machines, these IRIX machines. And I started learning Unix because, That's what I
LexisNexis
do.
is like the legal database, right?
Yep.
You,
It was a local place that did computers because that wasn't so common back then, and I was out in Ohio, and that's what we did. So I learned IRIX and Solaris, and
man, I knew that, but I had forgotten that. So you were what, in college when you got that job? Before
yeah,
graduation? Yeah.
yep, yep. And it was wonderful. Like I just spent, so it was, the job was easy. So I spent a lot of downtime just learning the operating systems and and again, getting prepared to go to graduate school so I could show up knowing that, because no one showed up knowing that stuff.
Oh my God,
But
we were
I
so
did.
different. I didn't prepare
I
anything to
was a
go to grad.
go-getter. So in the time that I was at Eastman for that 6 years, we moved everything over eventually to a full Linux studio, audio hardware caught up. We were running only RME, which sounded amazing. We weren't doing too much multi-channel immersion audio at that point. There was some of it, but not a lot. So it worked. This is back in the days when 9 GB hard drive was like a really, really big investment, and you thought, oh my God, that's worth more than its weight in gold.
So you were
But
using in this sort of in the late 90s, right?
mid to late 90s, yeah.
Yeah. So you were using computers running Linux, using the Linux kernel, using RME interfaces for audio in and out. And what kind of actual, like, what music were you making, and what kind of, what was the day-to-day like? What were you actually doing? Are you sitting at the screen? Are you recording audio in? What are you doing?
No. No. So, in short, C Sound was the primary teaching tool, and it's a beautiful way to learn synthesis. And the person who was running the studios, Alan Schindler, he had built a lot of scripts, Linux, terminal scripts. In fact, I would say not just a lot of scripts, a whole scripting package that one of my colleagues, one of my fellow students, Kevin Ernst, who's now at the he runs the Computer Music Center at Cornell. He built a whole package, downloadable package, installable script for Linux that deployed all of these things and installed programs. It was like he called it turnkey Linux or turnkey audio or something. Yeah. Anyway, that's the kind of thing we were doing. So
these gave you tools to build, let's say, synthesizer modules just directly inside the computer.
And it would do it mostly not in real time. It was offline. And it wasn't just C Sound. We would use other ported from the next system. So Unix is a fairly easy to port, well, not always, but it's often easy to port things between different versions of Unix. So we would get, like, we had our spatialization apps, which came from the Next Cube system, were called Move Space Place. So space, you can create a space. Place, you can place stuff in that space. Move, you can move it through the space, and it would calculate, do all the mathy math, and you could set a lot of parameters about the hardness of the walls of the room, and you could create, of course, what I immediately did is I created like a 40-mile long tube and then sent sound directly through it.
Which sounded exactly like what that would sound like.
Which is crap, but I would say first, the sound was so far away, there's no sound. And so for it's like 30 seconds, there's nothing happening. And then it's just like, it's just crazy. Yeah. Anyway, you just try these things out because
I guess that's over.
There's that. Guess I'm not doing that again. So, but you had to let these things compute, right? So you would, and this was how we did it for phase vocoding synthesis, all the different kinds of new synthesized languages or approaches that were being developed. Granular synthesis, which is now very, very common, was unknown in any other form. And you had to do it offline. So you would set up and build scripts that would, but the cool thing, because you were working in C, the programming language C, a version of it, I'd say, originally was called Moxie and then became C++ or C Sound. Anyway, the point is, because you were using a programming language, you could very easily pop in any kind of algorithmic process you wanted into the synthesis.
And so you're building basically what you guys were doing at that time. My understanding is, so I have, for example, a little performance sampler made by a small company called Torso. it's a mess of a product, but it is so cool sounding. It lets you manipulate samples in real time. And it has quite a few knobs and quite a few different types of algorithms that you can use, including granular algorithms. And so, in the granular synthesis section, you have a piece of audio, whatever that is, it could be anything, and it performs real-time granular synthesis on actions on that audio, and you change those algorithms by moving knobs, and they're all interacting with each other. And it is just, wicked cool. So what you're saying is what you guys were doing, and I imagine literally there's a lineage there, between the Eastman Computer Music Studio and there are, others around the world that were equally important that were creating these methods. And you're saying, you had to go get a beer with your friends while your granular synthesis engine was, running through its algorithms to create the sound that you wanted.
Eastman was right next to a coffee shop, still is, called Java Joe's, and that's where we would go. But
beer was not your thing, because
no,
you guys were just all amped up on.
No, we were just all drunk in the studio. Nope. And there were many more important studios. Champaign Urbana in Illinois. There's the big one was Karma out in California, still is.
At Stanford, right?
Yep, and then Earcom in France. There were others, and so the internet was new, but it was largely used by universities. So we would share these things on the internet as it was.
Yeah, and so when you were building all of these, so somebody had to write the underlying code that was doing the math. Was that done at Eastman? Who was building C-Sound and who was doing that stuff?
Well, you're going to catch. I didn't prepare for any of this. We didn't know we were talking about it. But the answer is there were several individuals at some of these different universities who were building, and I don't want to say their names because I'm going to get them wrong.
Well, people can look that up on Wikipedia. It doesn't matter.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Of course they can. It's 2025.
Just ask the AI. It'll tell you something.
Yeah, probably don't get it all wrong.
It's 80% likely that it'll be right. That's good enough, right?
Probably. Those are well established.
Anyway, I find this very interesting, and this is actually something you and I haven't really talked about a lot, but I find it very interesting because, I don't know, I think the lineage of these tools and the amount of advancement there's been in a relatively short period of time is just incredible. And we really, I personally, I'm very much, I'm a hacker coder, but I'm not a programmer, for real. I could not build these tools. It would take me years of learning to be able to do that. And I'm not going to do that. But I'm so grateful to the people who do that. And I find it very interesting how these tools build on each other. So, creating Unix, then creating the Linux kernel, then creating C-Sound, then creating all of the really incredible opcodes and things that you guys made in C-Sound in the mid and late 90s. I mean, these are all how all of these crazy instruments that we're using, the digital instruments that we're using today. My understanding is that most of these are directly running Linux in the box. So that I'm pretty sure the Torso sampler that I'm talking about, which is called the Torso S4, that's a little Linux box, right?
Yeah, they are.
And
I don't know what tools those are using, but I'm sure they're using libraries. A lot of them are.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. But, the actual musical stuff that they're doing, everybody making these instruments, that's part of their secret sauce. They're working on their own algorithms and their own ways of doing these things, but they're directly coming from this lineage of these computer music studios in academia, really, around the world. And without those things happening, we wouldn't have these instruments, is my very strong sense. Do you think that's true?
I do. Yes, I do. And I think...
just think about synthesizers for a second, right? I mean, FM synthesis came out of an academic's, research. Directly.
John Chowning, he was doing exactly this. And, okay. So the thing that happened that was very different there is that... So I ended up doing a lot of publishing and working at computer music conferences and such. And the first time I went to one of those, there was a couple of there were areas in the audience which are all academics, right, who look and act a certain way, and then there were these other folks who were clearly not.
Better dressed, more expensive clothes.
Yep, and did not talk to anyone and just sat heads down taking notes as fast as they could.
Oh shit! So who were those people?
They were from Yamaha.
Oh.
And
so these are companies who are directly trying to benefit from this research, is what you're saying.
Because as soon as you announce something in a technology, or you say, I have a paper, I'm exploring XYZ, you have now removed your ability to protect it internationally, and they can go, let's try that, or this sounds good, and they take it back to their company and they say, this is what we learned this year, maybe let's try. So yeah, I think a lot of that's probably how it cross-pollinates. And then, so for John Chowning, they made a deal, like, so Yamaha licensed it, FM synthesis, for a number of years before it really was released as a product.
From him and his university, it gets complicated, right? Because his university actually owned it.
He didn't, yes, they owned it.
He probably didn't make shit.
No, I think he had lots of benefits that came, and he certainly became he
became an icon when
he became an icon. He became a chair of a certain named chair, whatever. And I'm sure that came with money, but no, he did not make that money directly from that.
Yeah. I mean, and FM synthesis obviously changed the entire sound of music in the 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no telling how much money. One of the things that's really interesting about pop music to me is, just like clothing or whatever, the people who make it have a vested interest in changing the trend. I'm not sure, having spent some time with people in the music industry, I'm not sure how many of them really quite think of it that way. I feel like it has a little more life of its own and people just sort of follow. But, the new sound, right? I mean, think back. I don't know if Les Paul is one of the most important figures in my mind in pop music at all. And, he created this, I don't know, it wasn't really a band, but he called it Les Paul and the New Sound, because he understood very early that creating something that catches people's ears because they haven't heard it before is gold, right? And so the reason I'm bringing all this up, and the reason I kind of wanted to talk about this in the first place, is that these lineages of these people, kind of nerding away in basement computer music studios, have become, that has all led to, a very capitalistic music system, right? Where you've got a lot of companies making a lot of money from these technologies. But what I find really cool is that the heart of all that is still there. And that's something, and I consider, Linux to be a massive part of that ecosystem and a really crucial part of that ecosystem. And I think it's one of the reasons that I really, and let's talk about modern Linux systems for audio and music making, I think, because let's talk about where they've come, how they're like those old systems and how they're not. And that's something, not actually very many people would know that you would know. So I didn't start using Linux until, 2010, and then I didn't use it for audio until very recently. So I don't know what it was really like to do that. But what I do know is that those tools and those people contributed in a massive way to what we have available to us today. And I feel like that's worth exploring and worth recognizing.
So I can tell you about that a bit, and I'll try to be semi-nerdy and brief. I'll try. So in short, like, when you have a Linux machine, especially back in those days, you have power. You're working. You have the power to do anything you want as a compute box. How about that? So it doesn't come out of you don't install an OS. We used Red Hat for a long time. We switched around. SUSE was one of the other ones, and then Debian, of course. I learned later, but you install that Linux OS, which is not. It's just a collection of packages, really. This is what Gen 2 was another one I used for a long time, which it's still around, but it's more like Arch Linux, where you have to build everything from step by step by step by step. So Red Hat you would install from a DVD or a CD at the time, and then something more like Arch Linux, you're going to build component by component, module by module. When you do this, the advantage is you can make your computer box do anything you want it to, but it won't come out immediately ready to do anything. Okay, so you have to make it do what you want it to do. And that includes, for example, getting real-time processing priority for audio. And you
Mm.
need that so that the computer systems don't naturally interrupt the audio stream because that has to take priority. Okay, so that's a challenge in and of itself, as you now know, although that's been over several decades, it's been largely made very simple. But we were recompiling kernels at the time to constantly to make that smooth and to have functionality. Interacting with devices was just not really a thing we could do. So it was audio being built inside the machine and sent to the hard disk that we could manipulate, right? We weren't really, today you can, with a Linux machine, you're on Linux right now, and you can have it do all sorts of things with really great high-end devices, but that
Yeah, I have a
wasn't the case.
microphone, I have a camera, all kinds of crazy stuff is going on right now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Class compliance makes that something that, okay. But the, so there was, but here's an example. Here's a more practical example of why this is so cool. Because at the time, and it still exists, there's a thing called Jack in Linux, which was sitting on top of ALSA or OSS. There were two different competing potential sound drivers that were. So the closer you get to the kernel, right, you get more and more specific.
And also
as you
is the first sound layer on top of the kernel, right? Is that true? It's the
I don't know if it's
module
the first. It probably is close. It's close.
It's still what Linux uses today. It's the module that deals with sound and talks to the CPU. This is my layperson's interpretation of it. Yeah,
That's great. And then OSS was also an alternative to ALSA, and they did different things. They had different features. Now there's Pipewire. There's other things. But the point is, all that Jack would sit on these and run and distribute audio to individual software packages, right? Which meant suddenly you basically had direct access through Jack to low latency latency real-time priority audio processing, and you could move it between any piece of software you had open that talked to Jack. It had to have hooks, but it could talk, anything that could talk to Jack could suddenly do this, and you could send 150 channels somewhere if you wanted, right?
And is it true, I'm going to display my ignorance here. Is it true that when you say real time or low latency, which are two different things in CPU world, is my understanding.
Yep.
But either way, we won't get into the specifics of that. But when you talk about something like a real-time kernel, I think when I first heard that, and I bet most musicians would think this, they're just thinking about, no latency playing. Like if I play an instrument in, I want to hear it back, which is the effect. But that's not what real-time means in this sense. What it's meaning is, and again, I'm going to use my very layperson's understanding of this, and you can correct me. What I understand it to mean is that it's about computing priority. So the CPU is obviously doing just so many things at once in any remotely modern computing system that it has to prioritize tasks. And well, actually, that's where my understanding. So that's where I don't know. There's like a black box for me. Maybe you can talk about what's in it. Then on the other end, you have the musical understanding of real time. So if I have audio, the problem with audio is you can tell when something is not happening with immediacy, right? Because we hear it. And so that's where audio becomes a very difficult problem to solve. Is that correct? And what happens in the middle? Like, is there an easy way to explain that?
Sure. And I am not Paul Barton Davis. Like, I don't know. I don't build software at this level, but so I'm going to speak a little bit. I'm going to be at the very edge of my abilities here. But in short, digital audio in a computer is going to be little packets of information. They are going to stream together to form audio, essentially. This is very silly what I'm saying, but basically that's the case. So there's a flow that has to happen, and the resolution at which that happens will determine how much data is getting sent in that flow. If you have very high resolution, deep, 32-bit packet size, and you've got 192 kilohertz samples in number of samples per second, you have a lot of data that's trying to flow through. If there's any interruption at all, we're so highly sensitive to this.
So if you have a CPU computing and you have all of those audio packets flowing through, and the CPU decides something else pops into that, and it prioritizes something else over the audio, basically you end up with an audible problem, something that either sounds behind or it sounds garbled or fucked up.
Yep,
All
or
right.
glitchy. You get these
Yeah.
clicks and pops, and that's
I know
IRQs.
those click and
IRQs,
pops.
we all know those, and IRQs are the interrupts. Okay, that's what they're called. So it's like basically something in the computer comes to the CPU and says, "Hey, I need to talk to you for a second." And the CPU goes and looks over there for a minute, and and if it's so how you basically deal with this is buffer size, which means you are buffering a certain amount of processed audio so that the CPU can go deal with something else for a second, and there's still something flowing, and we
Because it has
don't
a bigger
interrupt the audio.
chunk, bigger than a perceptual chunk, much bigger.
Yep. But the more you buffer, the less immediate it is, and you get
So
latency.
then it gets behind. So there's a dance that it's doing. Okay, that's probably enough nerdy kernel stuff. But the reason I think that's important to talk about and understand a little bit is because, even when you use Linux today, so I've used all three major operating systems at this point for audio quite a lot. I haven't used macOS in a long time, but macOS has always had the reputation, and my experience, this was true even years ago, of being kind of the easiest for audio, right? That it's a stable system, and I never experienced things, like what I sometimes experience even on Linux today, where you end up hearing these problems, right? So,
got my hand up.
Yeah, stick your hand up, but I'm asking you.
Yeah, so the reason, yes, and also is how that, okay. So back in the day, macOS was its own little weird brew or whatever.
I mean, it's an offshoot. It's a Unix. It was originally Unix based, right? Oh my God.
It wasn't, and that's
oh my God. I feel like I just stepped in it.
You did. So it was a whole different thing, and that's what I'm saying. Back in the Quadra days, back in the Mac, the original Mac was its own thing. When Steve Jobs left, and then he created Next Computers, that was a Unix-based system. And when they came back and they built Darwin, anyway, all of that, and I'm so oversimplifying, and I don't know all the super nerdy details.
We're not.
The short of it is, it did become Linux-based or Unix-based. So it is today somewhat Unix-based. The thing that's happening with Apple, though, that creates what feels to be easier and less problematic is the fact that it's a super closed system. And it talks to very few. Today, it talks to most devices. But back in the 90s, you needed a Mac. What DigiDesign and Pro Tools was. Like, that was useless. It was a big, expensive hunk of nothing. Unless you connect it to a Mac with exactly the right Mac OS version and exactly the right software extensions. And if you did all that were authorized by Apple and Pro Tools, the system would sing and it would do amazing things. You could run.
So you're talking about like at the smallest level, what was it called? The inbox? Or what was that? There was an interface. You had to have the right interface to use Pro Tools.
Yep. DigiDesign created specific Pro Tools interfaces.
Right, and you couldn't use Pro Tools without them. Nope. But like you say, when you did have that all set up, it did feel like magic.
But that's because all of the inner stuff we just talked about, that geeky, nerdy stuff, was handled by these two companies. No one else got to touch anything.
Right.
And if it was locked in and the software versions were correct, and boy, it was easy to mess this up. We had so many on our Macs. We had just folders of just all the different wrong system extensions, and so as long as you had it working right and it was happy and it would handshake, everything was great. But again,
that's still true with Macs today. I mean, they haven't changed. They're still very closed. Now, what's happened is on the business side, they've succeeded.
There's a market. There's a market for hobbyists.
So hardware and software companies are making their stuff always work with Macs, but it's still conceptually the same, where it's working because they've built a monolithic thing that they change over time, their operating system, but they only control that, and so you're saying that's one approach to making things very sturdy, right? Is just having. Yeah.
Windows and Linux, of course, it's totally different. Windows is meant to be the operating ecosystem of anything.
The everything system. And it is. It truly is.
You need drivers for it often or not or whatever. There's different ways that gets handled. And then Linux is just not very much in demand on these things, so it's not super supported, although it's getting better.
Yeah, so let's talk about modern Linux for audio, because I think that's something, as I've talked to people online, and I've switched over to it recently for my studio, and people are really interested in hearing about what that experience is like, and is it worth it? So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about how I currently have my stuff set up.
Well, let me ask you some questions. You're good at asking me. I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
So, as I mean, this is your first real deep working with Linux on an audio perspective. Would you say you've used Windows, as you mentioned, and you've used Macs? Now, how would you say the ease of process in building and setting up your Linux system is compared to the other two, and how much of a learning curve, how much trouble do you run into? And I mean solvable trouble, because I'm going to allow, we live in an age where you can ask AI or you can ask the internet and you get a lot of help. So is it really that much more difficult? How much more difficult?
I would say it depends on the direction you go with it, and it depends on the hardware you're using. I think, so I have had, first of all, I'm a tinkerer, like perpetually. I like tinkering. I like optimizing. I like changing things to try to get it set up exactly the way that I want. And Linux satisfies that desire deeply. You can do that forever because it is so flexible. So
could you do it without being a tinkerer?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's a bit unfair to ask me. I think if you want to use Linux for audio and you are not a tinkerer, my advice to you would be to go seek out the most supported things, the things that the most people are using with success, and that includes especially an audio interface. And there are, some very basic premises behind how you might find that out. But find out what audio interface works, and find out what distribution, which is what they call the apparent operating system in Linux world, what distribution is going to be the easiest and kind of fit with your workflow and software the most. And don't try to force Linux to do things that it doesn't already do. So, for example, you might go get, I believe, Behringer interfaces. It's not a company that I love, but, I believe that Behringer interfaces are almost always totally great with Linux. And they're really inexpensive and, offer a ton of features for the money.
I can tell you they're class compliant. They, out of the box, they're plug and play. You plug an interface in, like 1280, I think is the big one, or whatever, and you get all 8 channels of analog and all 8 channels of ADAT right away.
Yeah, so it can't be simpler on any other OS. Like there's, Mac, Windows, it's all the same. It just works. It's actually probably harder on Windows to get it to work. So pick an interface, or maybe you already have one that's going to just work. That's thing one. If you're using external audio at all, if you're just making music in the box, then thing two is use software that is Linux native, right? Like use software that has a Linux installer that you can just install. And there are gradations there actually, because Linux is such an expansive landscape with such different things. But in general, if a software works on Linux, it'll work on pretty much any modern Linux distro.
And let's say that the big DAWs there, just to mention them, would be Ardour, Bitwig, and Reaper.
Yeah.
And then there are variations of those like Mixbus and Audacity, by the way. It's not quite a DAW, but anyway, these are
very useful for audio. Yeah.
These are just click and point install.
Yeah, you literally, and now, most distributions even have a GUI software installer. You don't even have to go to the terminal and do your apt whatever. Like you just search for it, just like on any, modern computing system. It's very, very, very easy. So I would say if you're not a tinkerer, that's the limitation that you need. And, and here's where it gets complicated for people. And I think this is a very interesting conversation to me, because what you will hear from almost any music person who produces their own music, as soon as you start talking about moving to Linux, and there are many reasons you might want to do that, and we can talk about those later maybe, but they say, well, what about my plugins? but I love this plugin. I love my UAD plugins. Those were the hardest for me. I love these, these plugin makers are very, very difficult in a Linux. The softwares are difficult in a Linux scenario, in large part because of licensing restrictions, right? So, these plugin makers are really serious about people paying for their, with good reason. They're in it to make money. I get it. That's how it works. And it's very easy to steal those. When I was younger, I used to steal plugins all the time. Don't tell anyone.
Did?
It's funny. I did a major, this is an official aside. Okay. I did a major, hard drive clean out and reorganization very recently. And I finally on an old hard drive, I just kept all of these old, hacked versions of all these plugins and music softwares just sitting there, just I don't know. I'm kind of a hoarder in this way. I'm like, maybe I'm on it. You never know. So finally I deleted them. So I don't have them anymore.
Wow.
They're gone just now.
Yep.
But I had Metasynth. I had some cool shit that I used to use. Metasynth is still awesome, I think. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and things like virtual instruments, that's another thing. Many, many great virtual instruments do not have Linux versions available. And then people go, well, but what about Wine? So Wine is a simulated Windows environment for Linux. And that's extremely complicated. I literally can't imagine. Windows is so crazy. It's so old. It's just this legacy massive pile of code. And, Wine does a pretty good job of emulating it so that you can run lots of Windows stuff in Linux. However, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, my interpretation is audio and peripherals are two very difficult things to deal with in an emulator for a lot of the reasons that we already talked about. The drivers, the real-time stuff, all kinds of things, and not to mention the graphics.
Anytime you introduce that kind of translation, you're adding lag.
Yeah, and just serious complexity. So the short of it is not all plugins work in Wine. And this is where I think you have to really step back and talk to yourself about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And self, why am I using Linux when I can't have my, for me, the hardest thing.
Who am I?
Yeah. Who am I? I don't know. The hardest thing was in switching, I'll tell you, for me, and it was losing. So at this point, we've talked about this in previous episodes, my studio is set up so almost all my music making happens in hardware, right? So I'm not trying to run a bunch of virtual instruments. I'm not trying to interact between the computer and my hardware, which is extremely hard on any OS to make work. I'm doing my music in the room, and I'm recording it pretty much all at the same time, occasional multi-tracking and overdubbing, but very simple, compared to what a lot of people do. And I'm just not doing a lot of music making in the computer. So what I am wanting to do in the computer is mixing. And I'm not setting some high bar for myself at this point. I'm just having fun. I want stuff to sound pretty good and, translate pretty well, but I'm not trying to, make pet sounds. I'm just not. So but because of that, because I don't want to spend a lot of time mixing in the computer, I like for plugins to kind of do my work for me at this point. I like to pop on, a smart limiter and just have it be the right volume. That's a little lazy of me, but you got to prioritize your time, right? So that's where I feel like I'm still having a bit of a struggle in finding those ways to mix on Linux where I am satisfied. I'm getting a great mix in the room, so there's not a ton to do, but those finishing kind of mastering, the lazy man's mastering touches, that's where I'm kind of finding myself, still searching a little bit for a good workflow there. So yeah, that's kind of what it is. If you're satisfied with the tools, you're not going to have a hard time. There's no tinkering required. But if you start to think, well, I really want, I really want these. I like the Arturia plugins a lot. I like for mixing. I like the Soundtoys plugins a lot for mixing. I'm running both of those on my Debian system, but it was hard. There was a lot of tinkering required and a lot of trying things. So, yeah, so that's what I would say.
Yeah, I would also point out that this has a lot to do with the way you want to work. This is not going to work for most people in professional situations.
No.
Who have deadlines, who need recall, all this sort of thing. But outboard gear, of course, will help you there because there's lots of ways. That's how I deal with it. That's how I deal with it mostly. There are sanctioned and very well built Linux plugin options. UHI is by far the best that I've come across. Where they have
what
native.
You do with the UHI plugins. I haven't got those yet. So in my situation where and it's similar to what you do, I'm multi-track recording everything. I don't have a lot of mixing to do, frankly, because I make that happen in the room at this point. But a little bit of mixing here and there, compressing the drums and bass maybe, or stuff like that, just very basic things, little EQ here and there. And then again, the mastering part, is where I'm still really trying to find the right set of things. So what do you use the UHI plugins for? What do they have and what do you like?
So, like you, I put in what I'm putting in and it prints the way I want it to mostly be. And that's an effect, or it's a consequence of the kind of music I'm making and the way I'm approaching it in the first place. So once that's there though, what I tend to do, and if I'm mastering, in quotes, mastering to distribute, essentially, as you said, I'm not doing Atmos mixes anymore, and I'm not trying to distribute for dance clubs or anything like this. Right. So there's a lower bar. What I tend to do is once I have my mix, I pop it out and bring it back as through some outboard gear, and that includes some pretty high-end stuff. So I've got some essentially channel strips that I've built. So I'm pointing to them.
500 series.
Yeah, 500 series Phoenix preamps. I've got Trident EQs. I've got an Elysia, another EQ. Once I capture everything in Mixbus and I've got my mix, I will send it out to my outboard gear. And I'm going to point to it. You can't see it. Maybe I can flash some pictures up of it. But I've got a bunch of 500 series channel strips that I've assembled or built. So I've got some Phoenix pre's, Trident EQs, some Elysia transient shapers, another EQ, and then it all goes through a very not shabby Rupert Neve master bus processor, which is a compressor, stereo, field enhancer. It's got a lot of things going on.
It's a magic maker.
It's a magic box. It's the way.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
Give it a little bit of silk. So I bring all that back in, and that's all done outside the box after my mix is finished.
And just to be clear, that's all really nice stuff that you have. A lot of people might not have that, but you could emulate that kind of thing. In any DAW will have those same basic elements that you can use, in the box.
In fact,
completely.
Yep.
Free.
In fact, my Mixbus app, which is built on Ardour, running in Linux, it has many of these things built in. It has EQs, so I don't need to do it this way, but I happen to like the way it sounds. And I've done A/B testing, and yeah, it sounds better, frankly, when you go out the box. Yeah. And it costs a lot more. So there's that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I've got my Mixbus stuff in my DAW. If you're using Bitwig or Reaper, you have tools for these things as well. And at the end, I'm using UHI, the Presswork compressor, and I use that on individual tracks in my mixing process as well. It's one of the most capable, most impressive sounding compressor plugins I've ever experienced.
Wow.
So it's not.
I mean, just to be clear, you have used a lot and owned the entire suite of UAD plugins, which are, I think they have, to my ear, some of the best compressors. I mean, they have modeled every classic, incredible studio compressor. And you're saying, and I haven't experienced this yet, I just haven't tried it yet. You're saying the UHI compressor matches that. Like it's as good as
Well,
those.
it's a little different. So I'd say it's got a learning curve because it has different faces that you can put on it. So you can keep it in simple mode where it looks like a kind of, 3-knob sort of deal, or you can use it in its, full operation mode, and you'll need a degree in computer science to get, not quite, but there's a lot you can change. There's a wide range of presets you can start from. But the reason it's so powerful, that's why it's powerful. In the UAD case, you get colored. They're attempting to model coloration of vintage hardware and whatnot. Not always, but often they do that. So the press work, you get control, is what I'd say. So when you have things set the way you want, then it's a powerful, great tool. The only other Linux native plugin I use is Air Windows, which is free.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a sweet.
And I forget what the guy's name is, but he's a prolific YouTuber, and is just constantly talking about his plugins on YouTube, which is kind of fun.
Hi, I'm Chris from Air Windows, and you can do this.
You can do this. That's right. I love that.
That's how he starts everything.
Talk about that guy's a nerd.
Oh, he's a nerd, but he's amazing. And his Air Windows is a suite of plugins, really, that is constantly growing, and you support him in his work because it's free. It's free to use.
That's amazing.
Completely.
Yeah, that's another thing. It's a little daunting, to be honest, the Air Windows stuff. I have a sampler that now it's a really great sampler made by a little company, almost a one-person company called Isla Instruments. It's called the S2400, and it's originally started it doesn't simulate the EMU S1200, but it's kind of does, or the SP1200, but it's very similar in its workflow. But now it's just a monster. Like, it does so much, and I have a DSP card for it now. It runs plugins. It runs Linux native ARM plugins that any plugins that will run on ARM, and all that guy's plugins will run on ARM processors. These very tiny, low-grade processors, I'll say. Again, not an expert, but that's my interpretation. And so I've tried to look at those Air Windows plugins, and I don't really know how to even approach it because there's so many. Like, how do you find the ones you like?
You can get what's called Air Windows Consolidated, and that is all the plugins at that moment, because again, he adds to it all the time.
Constantly.
Yep, you get the consolidated, and it's one plugin to rule them all, basically. And the value in the interface, so it's a very basic. One of the ways he's so prolific is he does not fuck around with making any kind of fancy interfaces. It's all just plain old dials, and it's very, very basic and bland looking. However, in the side of that, there's a side window. There's the dials that you change things with, and then there's a side window which has detailed descriptions of what the plugin does and how it works. And it's him. He's a very particular kind of person, so it's his like ranting about it or whatever. But so you have to read through it a little bit. It takes a minute. You spend 3 minutes reading his thing, and now you know how to use this gate plugin very, in a pretty great way. And he'll tell you about where the algorithm inspiration came from, or what it's trying to model, or how this, and you learn how each dial will affect the other. And it's free. It runs on all platforms. It's not something people talk about very much, and boy, I don't know why, because.
Well, I know why. I can tell you, as a cusp millennial Gen Xer, not having a pretty interface that shows you everything visually is very hard for us in the millennial generation. And that's one of those things that that's right.
I'm gonna look. I'm looking down my nose at you, or up my nose.
Greg is looking askance over his glasses at me, like a very old man now. And as well he should be, because the truth is, those, and this is something I feel like I've, kind of learned as I've gone back to, I come from a history of making music with a band where there's no computer, you're just in a room playing, like just normal music making. But then I also have done an awful lot of in-the-box music making, and I think I got accustomed over the years to having those like FabFilter style, the visual feedback that shows you what's happening in, say, an EQ plugin. And it can be really valuable, but what you have to do with Air Windows plugins is just use your ears. That's what it is. And, I think, again, this speaks to that kind of fast, easy, convenient mindset that we've all been, I would say, trained to value so highly. And we've come to expect it, right? And so you look at something like Air Windows, and it's not immediately accessible.
No presets.
You're not even, no presets. You're not really sure necessarily what to do with it. And not only that, when you pull it up and look at it, it ain't beautiful. Like, it's just there, and it's not showing you anything visual. So I think that's probably why it's been limited. But I would like to, I really want to explore that. Next time I have a real mixing project, I will definitely be exploring the Air Windows plugins and using those, because everything I've heard from them, and I use them, like I said, on that little sampler, which is so incredible. I mean, I've just got to say, I'm so impressed that happens. But those Air Windows plugins, because they don't have that crazy GUI, they just work in there. Like, you can load up any of them there, so you can do anything with those. I mean,
you could do it all. You do have to know how things work. You have to know how how to set the dial and use your ears. And you got to have good monitoring to do that. I was just counting up. I have 7 outboard effects processors. They're all pretty basic. I don't have like an Eventide H9000 or whatever they know. But
don't talk to me about that.
I know.
Don't even mention that to me.
Allison wakes up in fever dreams wishing she had one of those.
I do. At least like once a month, I wake up out of a dead sleep and go to reverb.com and look at all the Eventide rack effects
just
units.
To see if they came down by order of magnitude in price.
Yeah, like maybe today,
They're $900.
I realized just a couple days ago, I was telling you, I realized that basically they're named for their price. So, an H9000 is going to cost you $9,000. The 3000s cost about $3,000. Like,
Those
it's super weird.
Even though they're old. But my point was just that I have 7 outboard effects processors. Most of them are simple vintage reverbs, very cheap, a couple $100 max. Anyway, the point of that is to say I do a lot of that on the way in. I print things this way, so I don't have to have fancy, beautiful algorithmic CPU intensive reverbs, right? So you can get them. Air Windows does them, and Chris has good reverbs in there.
The other company that I just found, because I just spent the other weekend, I spent a couple hours looking for this exact, problem solving thing, which is, just a shine tool, for things that I don't want to spend 2 days mastering. I just want
shine tool.
It already sounds good. I just want to get it up to the level, and I want to give it a little shine. And I actually found something. I don't think I told you about it. And I'm not sure if you know about this company. It's a company, I don't know much about them, but they're called, I guess, Xsound, OEKSOUND. I imagine Scandinavian.
You don't know.
Anyway, they make a couple of very interesting plugins. One of them is called Bloom, and Bloom is a Magic Box plugin. Bloom, and it's Linux native, and I think they're kind of expensive. It's a couple $100, and they never go on sale. It's kind of like
UHI's a little expensive and don't go on sale. They're way worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would say you should check out Bloom, as a shine tool, because what it is I think the way they say it. I read the Sound on Sound article, which is always so useful, and I think what they say about Bloom is this is the EQ this is what we always wanted EQs to do, but it's not an EQ. It's a multiband compressor, actually, that ends up taking the place of an EQ, right? So it's EQing in a very smart way. And not only that, I would say the closest plugins I've come to, the closest plugins I know of that do something similar are like the Sonable plugins, which are machine learning based, doing all kinds of really fancy stuff. Bloom is algorithmic. It doesn't have any machine learning in it. They've just done very clever. Whatever they've done is really fucking clever. Like, it's very impressive because you turn it on and it just, I'm not sure it's supposed to be a mastering tool, but I used it on a finished mix, to see, and it worked. Like, it's like it just pulls the right things out, and it's changing, it's moving according to the signal that it's getting. Seems like most people use it as a mixing tool. They use it individually, and I think it could get dangerous there, frankly. But I did find that as a potential. That's something I haven't bought it yet. They have a very long demo, which is I think it's like a 30 or 45 day demo period, which is really nice. Also very clever, because if you use it for 45 days, you're probably going to buy it.
So,
But anyway,
touched on something.
things like that are starting to come up on Linux, where some of these really advanced bits of audio. And I think, to kind of go back to the original conversation, I have to think that part of it is that, Linux is where all that stuff started in the first place, right? It's where all this advanced audio stuff happened. It's open, so people are able to use it on their, on their hardware boxes, right? So all these developers are using it. All these hardware makers are now using Linux. And, I think it's a really interesting situation where you have a whole generation of people who are my age, who didn't come from where you came with it, who are the next generation, who just had the privilege and benefit of using all these tools in proprietary operating systems, right? Windows and Mac OS. But now, as they're starting to make tools, they're seeing the wisdom of using an open system.
Okay. Right? Yeah, and you sort of touched on this for a second, and this is maybe the most important, to me, it's the most important thing about it, which is why.
Yeah.
Why would you do this? So in the 90s, Linux was pretty crippled in all the ways we just discussed. Windows and Mac software you would buy a computer, you would compute with it. Yes, you had to compute the way they wanted you to. You had to use Microsoft Office or whatever and do that. But you still were buying a box that was under your control. And today, this is a big topic for another time, but this isn't the case. You are buying into subscription service stuff. You're buying, and so you're going to keep paying. You're going to pay tremendous amounts over 5, 10 years, even 2 years, really, if you're on the subscription train. But you're also so you're not going to buy software that you own. That's part of what I'm saying. You don't own that software. Mm-hmm. A lot of it's being run in the cloud to some degree. Not all of it, of course, but some of it is. And when that's happening, if you're working on someone else's computer, you are, and you're paying for that privilege, but only for today. And if you want to pull that mix up later, you better keep paying that tax.
Yeah. And you better hope that little company keeps going. You better
hope it's still there. And beyond that, even the machines, you buy a Windows 11 machine, you buy a modern Mac, they won't function. And this is getting more and more true by the week. These things aren't going to function without a lot of proprietary surveillance. And it's not a small detail. This is what's shaping our world. It's what's shaping our politics. It's what's shaping all of the things that we have going on.
Microsoft had the fucking nerve to just start taking constant pictures of everyone's screen and sending them back to their servers.
Telemetry. Telemetry. And for those who dive into this subject, you'll find, when I say telemetry, I'm talking about where your machine or your cell phone or your whatever that's phoning home. It's working on somebody else's computer, Google's cloud, whomever's cloud, the iCloud, whatever the fuck that is. They're gathering all that data. They're selling that data. You don't have control. And you can say, well, I don't care that they're selling my data. The problem isn't just that. Sure, good for you. You don't care. You like the ads. Whatever the deal is, the problem is now you're having inputs come in at you based on that stuff that are influencing and changing what you're doing and how you're thinking and what you're choosing to do with your time and where your attention goes, which is the most valuable thing you have. So again, this is a big topic, but why Linux? Because you can, as you used to be able to, and this isn't just an old man yelling at clouds, you can buy a computing box and compute with it the way you want and make choices that are yours without being surveilled and without having inputs come at you that try and change and influence what you're doing and how you're thinking and whatnot. That's why. That's really why. And you may say, I'm just doing my thing in my studio. I don't care, bro. Okay, great. But give it I wish we could do this. I wish we could sort of like allow people to see what happens when you put away your iPhone and your Mac or your Windows box for a couple months and you're using a plain old box that just has software that you run and doesn't have all the influence that the modern machines do. What'll happen is your life will change.
I will tell you, I had that experience. I mean, I ran Windows because for all the reasons that audio people say, because I was like, I want all this software, this is the software I want to use. It's the best software. And it is. Like, the software that's available on Mac and Windows is more advanced and does more things.
Polished.
There's no arguing with that.
Except with those few exceptions. There are some exceptions.
Yeah, I mean, there's great software for Linux, but just the sheer amount of absolutely advanced, crazy things that, that proprietary software does, it's amazing. And I'm not trying to take that away. What I am trying to say is, for me, the day that I booted up my Linux machine in this studio and, I do my work on it now, obviously that's perfectly fine. I'm not using Adobe tools anymore. I used to use those. All kinds of stuff I don't use. But the freedom that I felt it was like just a breath of fresh air in my life. And I didn't realize how intense that was going to be. But it absolutely has been, I don't have as much crazy software. But you know what? Like,
well,
people have been making music for a very long time without that. And my music is not better than theirs.
I go back. I'd say two things. The first, you walk into the studio like you described, and it's you and the gear and your ideas. That's it. Yeah. There's nothing else there. There's no upgrade game. There's no, you're not sitting at lunch going, oh, wait a minute. Do I need that plugin? Oh, that plugin. Okay. I'll download that one real quick. Or oh, this one doesn't work anymore. I'll do none of this. It's no distraction. That's a ton of time sink. Number two, oh my God, I just lost it. Just lost it completely. See,
I would say that distraction, is an excuse for people. It certainly has been, and it continues to be a temptation for me because those distractions actually make you feel like you're doing things toward what you want to do, but you're not. You're really not. Right? Oh, when you go,
that was what I was going to say. The next thing you said people made music for a long time without it. Of course, I've gone back and listened to music that I made with a totally in the box system just a few years ago. So 5 years ago, where everything was in Nuendo, all the plugins, there was no hardware at all. It was me sitting at a tiny little desk running my mouse around, playing on a silent keyboard controller, a Depfer controller. And as there's nothing about that music that was better. It was different. It made me make music differently. And frankly, even as a player, it made me rely on the DAW tools for a certain kind of perfection that I don't really like. I much prefer running without quantizing. Anyway, this is just me, but my point is, it changed the way my music is made, but not for the better, just different. It had. I listened back, and I don't feel ever when I listen to those things, and it's fine. I like the music I made, but I don't feel like a connection with a particular sound, and in large part because anything could happen. So it did.
Yeah.
It just did. I could grab the greatest recording of some orchestral instruments or something and throw them on and put them in these spaces. I mean, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's a magic tool. And if you're in professional audio production, yes, it's the greatest thing on earth. But I certainly don't have a connection to that sound. The stuff I'm making now, it's like steeped in its own juices, I guess. That doesn't sound very good, but it is in such a way.
That sounds bad.
It kind of reeks. Oh God, it's getting worse. It has an odor. It's odoriferous.
Let's move on.
Anyway, the point is it has a sense of identity in a way that my other stuff didn't. Anyway, so there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where you have to really ask yourself what you value. And I think, those excuses that we make to keep ourselves from having to pay attention and think really hard about what we're doing are real. And I think they're very prevalent in music making today. That if you just, and it's, that we're not the first people to notice this.
Right.
Like, if you just, get the right tools. Every GearTube YouTuber I've ever seen at some point makes a video like this where they're like, man, it really doesn't matter what you use. Like, you just, it's more important to focus on it and make the music you want to make. And then they like go make another Behringer video or whatever. Like, or video about X, Y, or Z plugin. And there's a place for that. We all want to know about this plugin, from a YouTuber. But the truth is, it's, you're going to be better served. Your music is going to be better served by focusing more on that and less on the tools that you use to make it. She said in a totally insane studio, where she has been spending all of her time for the last 4 years building it. So I don't know that I'm one to talk, but I do know that working in a Linux environment for audio for me has been very freeing in that way. It has made me spend less time thinking about the plugins that I think are going to make my shitty mix sound better. And I spend more time in the room listening. I'll be with a track for sometimes 3 days at a time in my studio, like just coming back to it and tweaking this here and there on the mixer and changing the effects routing to get the mix sounding great. And boy, my music sounds better than it did 5 years ago.
It really does. In fact, and when you do that, you tweak it for 3 days, your stuff is set for that track. Then when you move on and you create something new. Oh my God, I spent years rehashing things in the box because I could no more. And that's a beautiful, creative, freeing tool, which probably gets you to write better music, because at the end of the day, all that tweaking you do isn't going to make it that much better. You're moving it up a few fractions of a percent. Everybody says this, but it's so true. I think, frankly, it's probably easier for people to be distracted a lot by whatever the fuck they're... God damn it, Cubase and Nuendo, which you pay a lot of money for. The first thing that happens is it connects to the internet. It opens up a browser inside the fucking greet you box, and it shows you all the latest news. And it's not latest news. It's like Hans Zimmer says, this is the great... Like,
it's the latest thing they're trying to sell you. I mean,
wow.
And this really boils down to the business model of the internet, frankly, and software. And that actually maybe is the real undercurrent of why I love Linux, because it's not part of that business model. Yeah. It just isn't. It isn't. It's a different thing. And free open source software in general is a different thing. And I think, ad-driven shit and surveillance-driven, which is, if it's ad-driven, it's surveillance-driven. Great point. Surveillance-driven shit makes my brain hurt over time. It just does. And I don't need to explain to anybody why that's true. I can try, but the truth is it is true for me, and I think it's probably true for a lot of people. And I think if you're able to just give up a little bit of that convenience, and then frankly, like, Linux systems can do crazy modern shit, like really awesome stuff. We've talked about quite a few things in this conversation. Yeah, it won't run Ableton, but it runs Bitwig, and it runs it perfectly as the modern version. So it's just about it's maybe better than Ableton, actually. I will tell you, Bitwig is better than Ableton. You can even use your Ableton push, right, with Bitwig. You can, in a modern Linux scenario without any fuckery. I mean, you can just, it's pretty easy, very easy, in fact. No, it is. And it's beautiful. And, so if that's something you like in music making, that paradigm, you can do it. You can do almost anything you can do on these other boxes. You just have to give up a couple things, right? You will. But I would encourage people to try it. I would too. I think it is a step toward mental freedom, basically. I think it's actually a political resistance sort of thing too, frankly. Oh, shit. I mean, I thought we weren't going to talk about politics. We're not talking about politics. I'm just saying, I think if you value these sorts of things, it's not just freeing, like, I feel good. It's like, it will change your life and change the way you can think and function. Yeah. I agree. And I do actually also consider it to be a political act. And I think it's important. For work, I have one Mac. It's an old Intel Mac, and I have nothing but work on it. And it's a diseased machine as far as I'm concerned, meaning it's full of surveillance and all of its junk, and that's it. It knows nothing. It has my work profiles. That's all it has. And everything else is, for me, free. It's free of all of this. And it's, so you can live in both worlds, but you can't live in both worlds on the same machine and keep having Google accounts. And no, it's containerizing. You got to containerize. Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's a worthy topic as well. It's something we can talk about sometime. But yeah, I mean, I to wrap up, I would just really encourage anyone watching or listening, if this resonates with you at all, just try it. You can dual boot a machine. You can use it. Linux will run on almost any old ass laptop that you have lying around, because e-waste is hard, and you probably have something.
Your old Intel Mac that won't be useful anymore in a year. Put Linux on.
That's right. That or your Windows. This is the classic example right now. Your 5-year-old laptop that won't run Windows 11, which is it makes me so angry. Like, yeah, Windows 11 and Windows Recall were what finally snapped for me. I was like, I don't care what I lose. I am not participating in the system anymore. This is garbage. This is bad for people. It's bad for me. And so I would encourage you, if this resonates with you at all and you feel like that might be the case for you, just try it and give it some time. Like, don't just, pop in and say, oh, my thing isn't there that I need. Oh, this software doesn't work. I can't use this. Just try to go without it, because we all went without it, for our whole lives before it existed and someone convinced us that we needed it. And you probably can still go without it. Like, you can probably still, do what you want to do without that specialized piece of software that unless it's for work, and I get that. Like, sometimes for work, you got to do what you got to do. But other than that, you can make a choice, and I would encourage you to do that. So there's your Linux proselytizing for today.
Yeah.
I appreciate Greg for proselytizing me. When I asked him.
You can't be proselytized. What I did do was I said, you're not going to listen to anybody, but what I did do is I said, look at this. And you did. And then you went,
this is pretty good.
Like it. Yeah.
Yeah. This is pretty good. Yeah. Well, I think that about wraps it up for today.
Yep.
So thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for watching. And we'll be back at you soon enough.
Until next time,
have
be
a great
happy.
day.